welcome. First of all, thank you all for taking the time to join the talk. For those who don't know me, my name is Jamie Plower. I'm a Director of Architecture from Fidelity, focused on the DevOps space within our application lifecycle management product area. I'm excited today to talk to you about how we are approaching governance, compliance, and security at scale at Fidelity. So let's kick off. Just a mandatory disclaimer, I just wanted to call out this is a case study of our Fidelity Investments experience, and this is not an endorsement of any vendor or product or service. But kicking off, I think Fidelity, just for those who aren't aware, we're a large financial services firm. We have 75 plus years of rich technology innovation, and we're not new to our digital transformation. We're a highly regulated environment. It's of key importance to us that we deliver software at scale, but the security is a key proponent of that. As I mentioned before, I think when we submitted this talk, there's 15,000 developers have been informed since. I think we're growing to 16, close to 17,000 at this stage. So it's really critical in this industry that we are able to be really have a lot of confidence about how we're releasing software quickly, but managing that rich resource of the ecosystem of developers. Again, within this space, Fidelity, it's like any other company, there's a large competitive environment, constantly needing to innovate and ensure that we are always innovating and bringing the best of practice toward our delivery processes. And as they say in investing, past performance is no guarantee of future success. So as you can see from this, we're well on our way in our digital transformation. Cloud native technology and open source are a key component of that. But what we're going to talk about as we're releasing our software, how we're focusing on that delivery. So pipeline intelligence and how we're looking at our compliance. So underpinning our overall strategy and learning from the past is how we're focused on bringing together standardization as much as possible. It's really critical for us that from the past, one of the key areas we had around pipeline sprawl and ensuring that we look at our areas and ensure that there's not a lot of duplication around that space and that there's areas for reuse. We focus on how we are bringing together more standardization practices. So a key part of that is inner source and bringing together our various business unit groups and ensuring that we can bring together a layered approach to our delivery processes. And one area how we have achieved that is Fidelity Pipeline Library. There's nothing new about it. It's just bringing together the wealth of professionals in this space and ensuring that together we are learning from our past experiences and focusing on a capability model that we can all deliver together. On top of that, it's focused on then workloads that we construct from that. So if you want to take the analogy that the library itself is like the Lego blocks, the instructions themselves are the individual workflows that we are building through. And again, with that, we can guarantee much more immutability in how teams taking a cognitive load about having them to construct particular workflows and focusing forward on making sure that they are constantly up to date, have baked in policy, and tying that need as we go forward. Again, in our space, we do have different categorizations and standards that we need to adhere to. So we do have specific release workflows that on top of that have additional compliance requirements that are baked in from the front. So again, feedback from our overall community in the past was how they were not only stifling the innovation around bringing their pipelines together, but how they're constantly staying up to date with compliance. And the other angle that we have to think about is our compliance and audit units within the firm can't scale to every single team to the needs that we want. It's genuinely a painful process. So by making it a first-class citizen, making policy as code a default citizen within our capabilities is a critical aspect that we've been looking at. And again, I think just another key point to mention is it's not just the DevOps pipelines itself, it's actually looking at our future strategic systems and making sure that we're leveraging the platforms as much as possible so that they can catch things as far left in the process as possible, that we can achieve these items and remove that cognitive load from the developers themselves. So focusing itself, what is Fidelity Pipeline Library? What we did is this is over a 2-year-old initiative within the firm. We stood back, and I think one of the key aspects around it's not just understanding the default building blocks that we use that are common to every application workflow that we build. So we built a really key domain model. You can see here we have like source control management to builders, working through our DevOps value chain, identifying the key domains that we are interested in, and then within that having specific capability model that we can focus really, really clearly on a defined build activity and ensure that it does one job really, really well and have the community swarm on that. Now, like, why is this important? Like, going back to the pipeline sprawl initiative I mentioned beforehand there, without this, teams were either creating pipelines that had little nuanced needs. We weren't getting the benefit of reuse. We had limited governance opportunities because with that sprawl, we couldn't guarantee that we were having that appropriate security and governance controls in place. And naturally and unsurprisingly, a lot of the teams were bought into this immediately. And it took the discussion of like, I'm special, I'm different. Everyone had a voice. It was a democratic situation. And what we built out was this rich capability model very, very quickly. So we have 12 different business units. The spread across this was very distributed. And it means then that everyone's getting the single benefit of it. Another area to focus on was specific capabilities within our toolchain were complex. Some of the native deployments were quite bespoke between the teams. So we could leverage existing tooling that exists and help build that capability and grow it as its own little project itself. So it further developed more innovation and reuse and standards across the firm. And that's the key tenet that we're looking at here, in that if we're going to introduce some sort of scale of compliance, some standardization is really, really important. Flexibility is key to this as well. Our nuanced is a journey, so making sure that we were baking it in. But again, that had another aspect on how we were designing this work in the first place to make sure that there was no breaking changes, it was more reliable. And as we'll discuss a little bit later, further on, once you have this in place, how you can actually then extract data insights that will help validate evidence around attestation going forward. The process itself was really key in that we had a frictionless experience. The developer experience is key to this, ensuring that everyone, whether you're a hardcore programmer or a systems engineer or even light touch, that you can get involved. And how we designed this, that the changes were very simple to understand and a very clear way to remediate if a defect did come out. Going back to the catalogs that build on this, this allowed us to understand our application workflows in much more detail. There's one between CI, it's pretty well understood. It's not as a mature process within the firm, but CD itself, there's a lot of legacy there that we had built. And as people are migrating their application toward cloud, we want to have a much richer discussion, design these workflows with flexibility, and build in some flexibility that, for example, specific stages could be introduced around testing, for example, or how many environments they wanted provisioned, and how we could abstract that away into how we were building this. But again, from a audit compliance and security point of view, we could stand up and bake the specific practices that were required to this within the workflows that are being built out. So again, just taking this concept at a higher level, looking a little bit further, like one of the key areas that we understood is, okay, we've got a strict backbone across our DevOps value chain, but if we focus in on a specific capability, like what is that and how can we actually get specific data points from this? So looking at each capability, because it performed a well-defined task, the other area was that it provides specific context that was completely unique to the pipeline that was being run. So we decorated these individual capabilities with an eventing mechanism where we could extract all the input information related to that VAR itself, the execution lifecycle of that specific tasks that it's doing. So whether it be a unit test or whether it be a scan for a security analysis, not only could you get the specific contextual data or metadata related to that individual capability, but we could interrogate those systems on the back end to get the actual individual detailed results. Like, why is this important? Up till now, a lot of our security and related activities have either been trust-based or based on attestation, which is really an opinion. And it required additional load and more complexity in the pipelines for either egress calls or these bespoke workflows that I mentioned beforehand, just to handle these nuances around the process that you wanted to capture. This is all completely hidden away from the user. All they have to worry about is the core function that their pipelines are building, Information is completely extracted in a non-blocking performant way, and we capture the evidence requirements around that. And I'll talk a little bit more how we've identified the sort of key areas of compliance that we want to do. The other area that's beneficial about this as well is not only do we get the specific information related to the actual contextual data, we don't get teams hitting our individual systems in a sort of batch mode, it's more of a push model that's occurring. We get rich KPIs and performance indicators of, first of all, the landscape is more visualized around who's using what tools are in requirements, specific timings and engineering metrics that we can provide back to our wider teams. And then there's the ability now to actually perform real-time data analytics that's purely contextual to the run that's happening, which was something that we couldn't do before. And if you think about the value chain, as each of these individual data points is being collected, we now have the ability to do rich compliance calls that we wouldn't have been able to do before. So we can actually do really hard real-time gates within our specific pipeline stages based on the requirements. So that was the challenge that we were initially looking at. And again, this is why having the standardization and the inner source model, first of all, it pulls people into it. We can agree to define workflows, and then we have a rich extraction mechanism that we can all work on to help with this compliance items. It's not just the pipelines, by the way. This model is extremely flexible. So as new tools come into our CI/CD systems, whether it be for source control management, artifact management, we can leverage that rich ecosystem of webhooks, for example, to tie specific events in, for example, pull request information from source control management systems, artifact management systems itself, whether it be additional scans that might happen at that stage, other webhooks that we can enable from the actual catching things before they even go out and the assets being built. So we're not, again, trying to alleviate that further down the value chain or even worse out in production. And then we also have a huge focus of self-service onboarding within Fidelity. So all our role management is abstracted away. So for example, as we get toward production, ensuring that we have the right segregation of duties around logical access. A lot of these systems in the past, they were just transient actions that were occurring. So we can actually collect specific audit requirements of how a user, there's nothing stopping a user getting access to a group, then removing that access temporarily, or those types of controls. We can capture all that lineage through these other source systems. If a new tool comes on board, we can tie in this mechanism to that and deprecate existing systems. So it's very, very flexible. So again, moving on, this diagram just depicts at a very, very high level how this process works, again, across the sort of key areas. So we could have multiple pipeline orchestrators that have this mechanism to either produce eventing. The library I mentioned is purely, its responsibility is providing a specific context at that individual function level. So it lives there, it's managed there. As it evolves, that payload or that contract can effectively evolve over time. The orchestrator has the specific mechanisms to literally handle the eventing out to our data stream. The tools I mentioned there, they come and go. We leverage them best as possible so that we, again, are capturing things at that point of view, and again, have that ability to catch a wider net of additional governance items that we want to control. And you can see here that the FPL domains, or Fidelity Pipeline Library here, it just demonstrates across the board, all these events are just getting created and sent into the value stream. And it's very simple sort of Lambda-style architecture where we can capture things in a sort of more batch-oriented mode, or we can separate our topic topology around sort of real-time requirements. So those things that are needed, we can process in near real time and produce the data points that can be called back into the pipeline in itself. So for example, if you wanted a gate on unit test coverage or have a toggle around that, there's nothing stopping us providing that back. And as I'll talk about later on, if you look at the overall rich ecosystem, there's a huge possibility for us to do really, really rich compliance in a sort of more OPA-based model. The other side of this is we are democratizing this data. This is a carrot for the end engineers at the end of the day. And we want to make sure that all of this data is, again, pushed back to the developer community. So we provide not only APIs that provide evidence-related items that audit can easily see and just streamline that process completely and allow them to manage more policy-related items. We bake it into the capabilities and they can just have one place to look at it. Or secondly, we can have push model as well. So this because we're using a data stream, there's nothing stopping us providing specific subscribers to specific information that they can just toggle to as well. One point that's really, really important around this, it's not just preventative items that we're looking for. We are looking to focus a little bit on how we can provide a steel threading across our whole SDLC process, because the pipeline will go so far, but we do have other assets around the company that we need to work with. So for example, our ITSM models provide how in Fidelity we map our product lines against products across the board. Those products might have multiple microservices. How can we ensure all these assets are meeting the required scrutiny as required? So with the model I've just described, because we're capturing data points not only from concept to commit right the way through to production, we can start to build from the Git SHAs to the build IDs, right the way through to the artifact SHAs, and how they actually tie back into the ITSM model. And effectively, we're building this steel thread lineage across our whole DevOps toolchain. So we should be able to trace back anything that's in deployment further back to commit. Because as we have seen in the past, whether it be certain vulnerabilities, it's one thing having good control over your assets before they go out. But when assets are out there, how do you understand actually how they were remediated back in the first place? So we can have that clear ability and, again, demonstrate that the appropriate controls will be met all the way through the tool chain itself. This helps in various different ways as well, but the main point is to streamline the whole process, make it completely invisible to the end user, and then focus on specific assets that we have available to us that are pretty generic across any application type that are moving along. So just to recap a little bit, I think one area that this is our sort of more recent legacy state that we came from. As I mentioned before, we have multiple business units. They're running at different paces. They want to control over their perceived libraries and how that got wrong. But at the end of the day, we weren't getting the overall benefit business. As I mentioned, with inner source, you might provide a certain level of contributions, but you're getting everything else free. You've got more eyes on the problem, and it allowed a huge level of reliability that didn't exist in the past, and the community then swarms over any maintenance that comes about it. But it really was a very, very fragmented state, and again, this led to sort of multiple audit findings. It led to a huge amount of back-end processes around how we had to discover this, and it's just a huge pain point to our overall productivity. And again, I think we need to delays to impact to how teams will evolve, changes to their teams was another problem with this, because there was no central way that we could actually attack new policy or version, how we move that, roll that out. We were introducing potential risk that is just not acceptable in our modern way of delivering. So again, we've moved more toward this approach where using the standardization I mentioned there between the library builds and anything else that was related to the catalogs, we can innovate, we can get the best of breed. As new tools come, no problem, it's just introduced. We get the basic benefit from that. But all the information across all systems is siphoned into what we call pipeline intelligence or our DevOps intelligence. And from that, the evidence store builds up across what you're seeing at the bottom. So we have a DevOps council within Fidelity where we bring together not only our development community, but our actual C-level management. And that's a key level of importance to understand, that you get buy-in at all levels of the organization around this. Because at the end of the day, our goal is to deliver value to our end customers, not to get involved in silos where we're building and creating half the problem that we're trying to solve at the end of the day. So what we agreed, and I said this is the current incarnation of it, each of these you could dive into a little bit further and have sub evidence items related to it. But we focused on source control management and simple things, making sure that you have the number of approvers around the pull request in place, ensuring that the person who wrote the code can, for example, circumvent that process. People who traditionally had more administration controls across the tools couldn't sort of tweak them in a specific way. So we have that standardization in one place. We have the appropriate ITSM controls and naming conventions around what we're doing, and the appropriate scans happen at source control. So for example, that we're not detecting vulnerabilities way down the food chain when it's harder to solve at that stage, and again, treats the developer to sort of learn and improve on that aspect of it. From build, it's really important, I suppose, that again, going back to the lineage question, that when we create an artifact, once it's immutable and then it's propagating through the various environments down, we can ensure we got the appropriate segregation between non-production and production, and the appropriate controls are processed in there. Again, you could argue some of these are arbitrary. For Fidelity, just making sure that the appropriate static code analysis is being mentioned, certain levels of coverage are being met, the appropriate testing and effective understanding of that. And as we capture this over time, we can really have a more interesting discussion with engineering managers around the quality of how we're testing and validating and actually spending time validating our application. And how we can shift left to more local development, for example, to get faster feedback and improve that. Making sure that the artifacts are clearly are documented, scanned appropriately. We can collect the artifact shards to build that lineage back to when the commit happened through the builds right the way through to the artifact store. That opens up the window to now the deployment domain, that we can ensure it's gone to the appropriate environments. As we get to our sort of non-unit, but more, whether it be integration, acceptance, performance level testing, that it meets the appropriate rigor and criteria that's required. We have different categories of application, and again, with all the data points that we've collected, we can introduce additional levels of rigor if required to ensure that they are met and there's flexibility in these standards and that they can be actually adopted. But overall, the goal is to change the whole culture, how we develop software, that it's easier to get these data points, less thought to think about it, but making sure that we're at a required standard. And then for production, it's hugely, in the scope of Fidelity that we have, there's a lot of different systems, we have a lot of different applications. So how do we ensure that people don't have persistent production access, for example? Everything is abstracted through a deployment pipeline in there. The appropriate segregation of rules, certification of our various groups, the list goes on. All of these policies we can bake in and externalize through our risk and audit and apply based on the data points that we collected. And again, we work with our application teams to ensure, and their engineering managers to ensure that here, if the fingerprint doesn't exist on the evidence store, it's going to be harder for you to get to production effectively. And there's a lot more, again, that's again an additional sort of culture element that we can add to this too. You'll go quicker, you'll go faster, you will be guaranteed to be secure. And then from the audit point of view, just the nature of our business, it's really critical for us to ensure that we simplify that. So in summary, it's pretty simple. It's collection at a high level. It's making sure that we are working as one company and not in silos, bringing everyone together. It's really understanding, and the beauty of this model is that things will change, and this can cater for that. At the end of the day, there's data points coming in, but it's really the signal collection. And then, I'll be honest with you, the sky's the limit. The potential beyond audit compliance and security to gain insights that we can feed back to development teams, security teams of interest in this data, metrics and analytics beyond it. There's many rich use cases that we can use, but it's all about improving developer experience, having the standards in there, and ensuring that we're meeting the appropriate audit and compliance guidelines. So, I know I'm coming up to 24 minutes, so I wanted to make sure there was some time that we could talk back to the audience. So, thank you very much. I hope that was of interest. So I know we have a mic available there, so happy to take any questions. Do my best to answer them appropriate.
Hi, I'm Beth Pariseau. I'm with TechTarget. If somebody wanted to follow this model, are things like pipeline intelligence available in open source, or are there open source tools that underpin them that people could put together themselves?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think, like, from our point of view, we looked at this, we couldn't see anything out there, even within the orchestrator. So I think we're working with some of the vendors around contributing back some of this work that we've seen, specifically around that eventing mechanism. And even further, the way we've built Fidelity Pipeline Library, it's completely agnostic to Fidelity. At the end of the day, we're working with tools and the adapters around that. So it is something that we are looking to work specifically with the CDF Nation to see how we can understand. There are some projects that, for example, we've got CD events now, there's cloud events out there, so different providers, whether you're talking to native services, like whether it be Kinesis, SQS, or whether we want to talk to Kafka, for example. I think there's a lot of ability to have a pluggable model around that. So I think that's some of the direction that we want to go, but we've more been focused, to be honest, in our internal successes to gather the core problem that I've outlined here. So I hope that answers your question.
I have a pretty loud voice, but I guess it's safe to go with the mic.
Go for it.
When you were talking about the C-suite buy-in and you were kind of deploying, obviously you guys have, I don't know, dozens if not hundreds of different business units that were all doing this. What was the time frame process like, and how much of it was, maybe this was a crude question, education versus enforcement?
Yeah, and really good question. Like anything, this is a journey. We do have, like you mentioned there, if you look in the past, a lot of legacy systems, a lot of sprawl, even multiple instances managed by different business units as traditionally. So when this vision was looked at, it was very much focused on the strategic systems, and then obviously a clear roadmap around decom of the older systems was there. So there was plenty of pre-warn that this is coming, I suppose. And again, this is where a lot of the early adopters were very keen to get involved in the project. Everyone sees that coming through. I think the most surprising is when you see the community start swarming and the value coming, because initially there's a natural resistance around I like control, right? But when you actually have like some of the interesting debates that you have around specific even capabilities, you can meet everyone's expectations. It's really more of an engineering design question. And it's really around how you domain that scope of what you're talking about. I think that was really key to the model. And then as the wider, why would you spend time just building the same thing when you can contribute on innovating on that? That's the questions that need to ask. And again, Fidelity's gone through a rapid transformation around those type of cultural changes that we've had. And let's be honest, as I mentioned, with the competitive environment out there, we can't afford to just constantly build the same thing wrong. It's about coming together, having more richness and robustness and reliability. And I'll be honest with you, we haven't had a breaking change in this whole project since it was initiated, all down to this. And a lot of the problem that we found from developers, as I said there, the people had central teams that were throwing this over the wire, and then it was left with the developers to really test it. And this was another problem that was happening. So we've had times that we've had over-opinionation in something similar, but then by bringing in inner source, everyone gets involved, so everyone can discuss it. So it's a win-win for everyone, but it's sort of, we're getting better at it, but I think this project has been a real eye-opener to how the value can be realized very, very quickly. So I think that's the carrot for the other teams. You will have outliers, there's no doubt about that, but over time when the mob sort of swarms on this, they get more isolated and it's harder for them to, I suppose, justify that. And then at the end of the day, let's be honest, they don't see the risk. And then with the data points that you get out of it, that's the real carrot. Like there's a huge richness in that data that we've never really uncovered before this initiative. So it's all about transformation, it's all about change, and I think as the whole company comes together, we'll get a better outcome. And it is a journey, there's no doubt about that. So. Okay, a couple more questions there.
Hi, have you found any interesting patterns or insights from the data so far?
So how many interesting patterns are?
Oh, have you found any interesting patterns, insights, just developer behavior, just anything?
Yeah, like I think it was more interesting when you actually got down to why I'm different, and then you actually talked to that. It was really around, they were trying to collect similar, like there is the actual, at the end of the day, build code, deploy code, configure code, test code. That was the overall pattern, but when you actually got into it, people were trying to, I'm different because I wanted to actually have this special process that around something that I needed. You know, it wasn't really justified overall. I think we're learning just our own footprint and sprawl, and I think people are learning again how to do things better, and that overall serves Fidelity better at the end of the day. I think as we understand, like one danger with this, I think, is like just making sure people are, when you talk about metrics and KPIs, how they're interpreted, how those types of things are done. So from audit compliance and security aspect of it, it's clearly defined. It's a clearly understood problem. And I think we're understanding interesting behaviors that maybe didn't exist, that this has sort of raised up. And it's amazing how that then changes the discussion when you're working with teams, right? Because beforehand, to their best intent, they're trying to do a good job. Everyone's under delivery pressures. But when you look at what we've just described there, it's just taking that cognitive load away. And it's, at the end of the day, you've got the fingerprints, you don't. But it's just spread beyond minimal compliance or governance, but across the full value chain. So I yet to see many innovation opportunities that we can gain from this as we go down, because it's beyond just the remit of this talk, like it goes further.
Hi, thanks for the talk. My name is Danny from JP Morgan Chase. Very interested to see the models and frameworks you have are very, very similar to our environment. So my question to you is, I think a year or two back, European Central Bank required a lot of evidence from development teams. What was your experience around that? I'm assuming Fidelity was impacted by this regulatory requirements, and how did you roll out some of these standardized checks and evidence collections, and what was the reaction from the developer community? Did they experience any reduction in agility and due to all the new toolkits and things like that? What are your opinions?
Again, a great question. I think overall, and it ties back into we do have certain standards that we do need to meet that was there. At the end of the day, the rigor of audit, and regardless of what goes on, was a pull on the teams any single way. So I think anything we can do to improve that was better than what we have right now, right? And again, I think it's just when you look at the scale of what Fidelity's doing, like some of this goes back to the specific audit teams themselves, like those practices were occurring. And again, they don't know what they don't know. So as they peel back the onion, it was going a bit further, right? So at the end of the day, everyone wants this. Everyone wants to go faster. It's just targeting, I suppose, the highly criticality compliant applications initially, and then bringing in that culture that everyone swarms in it, because just because they have that doesn't mean they should not adhere to it, right? So there's that overall culture of change that's happening. But no, I think my point is that the applications are under the scrutiny regardless how quick or fast they go. It will get them because they need to meet these standards. That's just a non-negotiable item for Fidelity. But anything that we can do to improve that and surface the insights, because with the sprawl that we had there, they may not even been aware that a new compliance item was there, and it was either this how quickly they have to stop, either, to your point, agility of building new features to actually address the technical debt of managing the audit compliance needs. That was a key frustrator for teams. And it was also a big risk that when you had, like, for example, the Log4j scenario or some of the other vulnerabilities that come out, how quickly can we react to that? So the problem compounds. But look, I know we're off at time at the moment. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to be around for the next 2 days, so more than happy to take any offline discussions that anyone wants. So thank you very much.